Jacinda Ardern, her ministers and about 30 public service chief executives are taking a 20% pay cut over the next 6 months. But it doesn't go far enough for ACT leader David Seymour. Among the bosses taking a salary haircut are the CEOs of Corrections, Inland Revenue, Oranga Tamariki, and even the Director General of Health, Dr Ashleigh Bloomfield. But ACT leader David Seymour wants all MPs to take a pay cut.
And the only way that can happen is if Parliament legislates it. The Prime Minister can't just change the salaries of her parliamentary opponents. That would be a really bad constitutional situation. But Parliament can vote for it itself. And I've written to all other MPs with that legislation, suggesting that we should all get together and support passing it in one day on the 28th of April.
So are they lining up to do that, to take a pay cut?
I haven't had formal responses from the other party leaders, but in the media they've been saying that they're open to the idea. I expect that with the impetus put behind it by the Prime Minister's announcement today, it should become clear to parliamentarians that we must legislate a pay cut for ourselves. We're a House of Representatives, and the people that we represent in the private sector are already doing this up and down the country, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. It's critical that Parliament shows the same leadership and the rest of the public sector, or at least the higher paid civil servants, follow suit.
So is this about saving money or is it about showing solidarity? Because in terms of the money saved, when you put it up against what's being required to be pumped into the economy, it's peanuts, really.
Well, that's right. The Treasury are throwing around figures like 60 billion. I know people think MPs are well paid, but we're certainly not in that ballpark. So a 20% reduction will not impact the government budget in a noticeable way. But it is about setting an example of solidarity with people in the private sector and what they're facing. And by setting an example for the rest of the public sector, if there can be wage restraint amongst the higher paid executives across the government sector, that actually starts to save substantial money.
So why 20%? And give us an example. What would that mean to your average MP's pay packet?
So the MP base rate, I think, is a bit over 162,000. So 20% of that means that you're taking just over 35,000 a year. I'm proposing to do it for 6 months. So that is going to reduce the salary by a significant amount. People can argue and get into an auction about what it should be. I just know that MPs shouldn't stay at 100%. We should follow suit with people in the private sector. Now, you look at Les Mills, you look at Fletcher, you look at private sector companies up and down the country, they're already taking this initiative. It's just a pity that Parliament, having suspended itself, can't follow suit rapidly.
Okay, so among those, public service chief executives, you've got the boss of Corrections, the Solicitor General, Customs boss, chief executive, Iona Holstead, who we've seen a lot of recently from Education, and even the DG himself, Dr Ashleigh Bloomfield, is taking a pay cut too. Should Crown entities be next? And who should be in that list that takes a cut?
Well, first of all, I've never begrudged paying those chief executives well. We want competent executives in charge of major organisations such as the Ministry of Health. However, just as it is for people running private sector organisations, taking the 20% or whatever, I think it's difficult to argue that the public sector should not, because if they don't, we find ourselves in a situation where suddenly the public sector, which is responsible for managing this crisis, and by failing at it to the extent they do is damaging the private sector, actually end up profiting off having a source of taxpayer money and being able to get funded by the Reserve Bank, which is also happening. So it's critical that the public sector does not gain an advantage in this crisis over the private sector, because in this country we need both.
So can you name any names of who else should be added to that list in terms of Crown entities?
Well, I think if you go through it, first of all, you've got your SOEs, your state-owned enterprises. They should be following suit with their private sector counterparts, your Kiwi Rails, your TVNZs, for instance. And then you've got your core Crown agencies. You've mentioned your Ministry of Education and so on. And then you've got your quangos, your quasi-government organisations, your Human Rights Commission, for example. So you go across the public sector, you've got a lot of people on multiple six-figure salaries. I don't know if you like your boss, but obviously RNZ would be one of those too.
Can you get this through?
Well, I've got the legislation drafted. I've written to all the other parliamentarians. I've invited them to vote for it. I'll be very disappointed if they don't, but if Parliament doesn't legislate, I can tell you that other MPs and myself, I think, will be taking the initiative and donating what we would have lost to charity because it's the right thing to do.
Is that guitar in the background so that you can compose a wee ditty about pay cuts in your spare time in the bubble?
I tell you what, I don't know if you ever saw me dance, but I just want to tell you that I'm even worse at music, so I don't think that's the most effective way for me to campaign.
And that's ACT leader David Seymour Skyping us from his bubble with his guitar in the background, talking there about his bill that he wants to introduce for all MPs to take a pay cut of 20% for 6 months.